Hi, my name is Kristen Chrisman, and the next 4 videos will be about Israel-Palestine relations. On Wednesday, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu stated, quote, "Our war against Hamas is a test for all of humanity. It is a fight between the Iran-Hezbollah-Hamas axis of evil and the forces of freedom and progress." He stated, "We are the people of the light, they are the people of darkness. Light will triumph over the darkness." End quote. Now, where have we heard that before? Forces of light versus darkness. In Ukraine, supposedly, fighting against the evil empire, the darkness, the darker vision of China and Russia are referred to in Biden's national security strategy. In every single U.S. war, supposedly the U.S. government is representing the forces of light, freedom, humanity, and the enemy is always darkness. But this perception of conflict as good versus evil is false, and I'm not just stating that as dogma, as a belief. I've been researching conflict for 20 years, and if you look at the causes, the motivations of violence on both sides, you can always find understandable motivations on both sides and understandable grievances. It doesn't mean that the violence is right, but you've got to address the grievances, and there's humanity on both sides. There's humane concerns. So it's also very psychologically immature to consider international conflict to be good versus evil. And it's a shame that so many world leaders do perceive conflict in that way. We need to have leaders who are psychologically mature. But we're always told that the enemy, the bad guy, strikes out of the blue, is malicious, aggressive, is unprovoked, right? Russia was supposedly unprovoked. Al-Qaeda on 9/11 was allegedly unprovoked. Hamas on October 7th was allegedly unprovoked. Always unprovoked. But that's a lie. And the thing is, the good news is, if we find that the enemy has, or the so-called enemy, because I don't consider any nation as an enemy, but if we consider the enemy, if we find that the enemy has legitimate grievances, that's good news. That's not something to hide, because that means we can take steps forward together, solving those grievances, remedying those legitimate grievances, and proceeding with cooperative negotiation. If the enemy truly were malicious, aggressive, not wanting to negotiate, as the enemy's always painted, then yeah, you can't negotiate. And then you're taught that, oh, and that's why we need war. But the truth is there are legitimate grievances, and the same holds true for Hamas and for the Palestinian people as a whole. In June, I was asked to write a memo about the consequences of apartheid in Israel. And by apartheid, I mean systematic ethnic discrimination that denies an entire ethnic group their human rights, their legal rights, friendship, respect, kindness. And some people might call it apartheid in Israel. Some people might not want to use that term, but whatever you want to call the system now, what are the consequences of what's going on now? And this is written in June, well prior to the October conflict. But considering the large-scale violence that has erupted this month, I thought it might be a good idea to read my memo, which I've divided into 4 parts, in case it's helpful. I hope it is somehow helpful. And I describe 16 consequences of the current system, of the current relations between the Israeli government and Palestinians. And then I conclude with recommendations. So in this part 1, we'll talk about consequences 1 through 6. I'll call this part 1, Tending to the Fronts of Conflict. Number 1, death, destruction, despair, and dread for Palestinians. That's the first consequence. The terrible, obvious consequence of Israeli policies which have existed towards Palestinians for decades, and which are now worsening, has been the physical, social, and psychological harm done to Palestinians. The worst consequences are the killing, aerial bombardments, beatings, beatings to death, torture, assault, arbitrary arrests and detentions, and collective punishment, which are committed by Israeli security forces with impunity. And that sentence, you know, some people are very empathic, and that sentence will already hit them, but others, just the way their brains are configured, they actually need to read the stories, read the interviews, see the pictures, to really feel what all that means. You know, to have your child walking to school and get killed. It's just arbitrary killing has been going on, and assault. Palestinians also are routinely subjected to, quote, torching of field and livestock, theft and vandalization of property, end quote. Associated severe consequences are the psychological damage to the victims and their families, friends, acquaintances, and communities, which leave so many permanently deprived of inner peace, love, trust, and joy. And I hope to post the essays, and then you'll be able to see the endnotes, because everything's documented. With Israel's new extremist coalition government's heightened demolition and eviction policies in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, another severe consequence is the destruction of hundreds of homes and the terrible fear and dread experienced by Palestinians at all hours of the day and night. You can't even go to sleep peacefully. They never know whether and when their houses are going to be demolished in the West Bank. And that's quoted from Al Jazeera. In addition, not quoted, but the source is Al Jazeera. In addition, the more than 2 million Palestinians of Gaza have been permanently trapped in Gaza with severely limited access to consumable water, electricity, and health care because of the 16-year air, sea, and land blockade imposed by Israel since Hamas gained power over Gaza from the Fatah-led Palestinian Authority in 2007. There was an election, and Hamas won the election. But that's 16 years of a blockade. And they say that this October 7th attack by Hamas was unprovoked? It would be shameful, immoral, and a betrayal of its own principles of humanity and democracy for the U.S. government to support such behavior. And here's a little map. A lot of you may know this. Israel, it's shaped somewhat like a dagger. Here's Jordan, Syria, the Mediterranean Sea, Lebanon's up here, Egypt's here. So this is the southeast corner of the Mediterranean Sea. So this is the West Bank, where the Palestinians live, but Israel, since 1967, has been occupying these territories illegally. The West Bank, and the Jerusalem's right there. This is the Gaza Strip, where the 2.3 million Palestinians live, but they've been blockaded. This is the Golan Heights, which Israel is occupying illegally, although the U.S. government considers it to be legal now. But those are the occupied territories, and the West Bank is where the homes are just being demolished and crushed, and Gaza is where the war is right now. Valid humanitarian concern and horror over the suffering in the 1930s and 1940s of Jews in Nazi Germany, and at other times and places where Jews have suffered and suffer from anti-Semitism and pogroms. That's valid caring for that suffering, but that valid caring should not eclipse our need and desire to care about the suffering of any other group of people, including those harmed by Jews or by the Jewish government, by the Israeli government. 180 degrees of empathy is a dangerous thing. If you only have empathy for one side of conflict, it can lead one to take extreme measures to protect a certain group, while blinding oneself to the hatred, immorality, inhumanity, and injustice of one's own actions against another group. We've absolutely got to have 360 degrees of empathy and care for people on all sides of conflict, which involves acquiring 360 degrees of truth. You've got to hear from all perspectives. This is not only just, but it is the most effective and long-lasting way to help each side find peace, justice, mental and physical health, and happiness. I think the best way to help the Israelis is to help them learn to care about the Palestinians. And the best way to help the Palestinians is help them learn to care about the Israelis. Because that will help create peace. Second consequence of the apartheid in Israel: destruction of Israelis' social and personal psychologies, damage to both sides of a destructive relationship. Support for inhumane, inegalitarian treatment of Palestinians harms the behavior and mentalities of the Israeli people themselves. Whenever there is a relationship between people that is both hierarchical and unkind, people on both sides of the relationship suffer and become less than what they could be, not only economically and professionally, but morally and psychologically. Reading about Israeli brutality towards Palestinians, indiscriminately beating Muslims worshipping in Al-Aqsa Mosque in April 2023, including the elderly, using excessive, painful force on Palestinians, reminds me of the sick mentalities of some Americans back in the 1800s, who were, and before, who were particularly cruel slave owners. Something had gone wrong with their minds. They seemed to relish lashing the slaves mercilessly. Not all slave owners, but the particularly cruel ones. Some were heavy alcoholics. They had severe mental problems. One wonders whether they had good relations even with their own families. When I read in Al Jazeera how the Palestinian Asim Khater has not been allowed to make any changes to his home in the West Bank, or build a single additional thing on his property, I see the Israelis in power as having entered the dimension of mental dysfunction and mental illness. Quote, Israeli authorities monitored Khater's home and the surrounding area for 17 years with constant patrols and surveillance drones. Any construction tools were confiscated and any new structures were demolished. End quote. That's from Al Jazeera. It's not only the military that goes after the Palestinians. Israelis living in nearby illegal settlements in the occupied territories are paid to inform on Palestinians who build. Israelis are using drones to make sure that Khater doesn't add a porch or window to his house. Think about what that means about the minds of those Israelis who created and enforced this law. They've become obsessive, crazed, paranoid, and hateful. They're micromanaging, control-obsessed, and wasteful with their funds and resources. And they're building a culture amongst themselves that breeds these qualities. How many Israelis feel psychologically peaceful, living in a nation that feels the need to be armed to the teeth in order to be safe against its neighbors and safe against its own Muslim, Arab inhabitants, Muslim/Arab, because Palestinians, most are Muslims, but some are Christians. Most of the Palestinians are Arabs, so I'm calling it Muslim/Arab inhabitants. How many Israelis appreciate universal conscription and the culture that has evolved from a mentality of militarism, brutality, prejudice, and ethnocentrism? As U.S. presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. stated, the violence we use internationally comes home to haunt us in the form of violence within our nation. He was speaking of the United States. But the same happens to Israel. Patterns of behavior and thought are transferred from one level of society to another, reflected back and forth, sometimes deliberately, sometimes unconsciously. It can become automatic. Israelis are going to develop these qualities, if they haven't already, in their relations amongst themselves, not only towards Palestinians. That is my theory. Do Jewish Israelis want to be treating Palestinians in ways they would not want to be treated themselves? Is this the behavior they want to role model for their children? Is such behavior actually in accord with the principles of Jewish law? Consequence number 3. Neglect of the multiple fronts of conflict and inculcation, brainwashing of poor habits, indoctrination of poor habits of human dynamics at each front. The major publicized front of conflict we always hear about pits Palestinians, who are largely Arab Muslims, on one side, and Jewish Israelis on the other side. However, the removal of all Muslims and Palestinians from the Mideast, from the entire Mideast even, would not result in Jewish Israelis living happily ever after. Not even close. Furthermore, the removal of Israel, the entire removal of Israel from the Mideast, would not result in Palestinians and other Muslims living happily ever after. Not even close. This is because there are many other fronts of conflict within each side. So you've got the major publicized front and then other fronts that are not as perceptible. Fronts that would surge to the foreground if the main front disappeared. In fact, while current discussion considers whether it would be preferable to have a two-state solution or one-state solution, ideally with respect for human rights and equality, in reality probably about 6 or 7 states are necessary to create governments that represent and satisfy the sharply conflicting views on both sides. In the case of the Israeli versus Palestinian conflict, the less publicized, quote, minor conflicts, I'm putting it in quotations because they're not given the publicity, but they are so heated, vicious, numerous, and long-lived that the removal of one side of the major conflict, the eviction of all Palestinians, or the eviction of all Jews, would probably result in other fronts taking menacing strides to the foreground. It also doesn't seem likely that the Israel versus Palestine problem can be thoroughly resolved without settling the minor conflicts, because surely some faction on both sides won't be satisfied with any Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement and will start blowing people up. It's only logical that the existence of multiple fronts of conflict and the constant birth of factions within factions should influence the choice of methods to handle these conflicts. While it's a popular custom to unite different groups to fight the big, glorious fight against a common enemy, it really makes no sense for one side to try to slaughter or subjugate another side unless that side also thinks it's worthwhile to slaughter or subjugate all the other factions within its own side with whom it will soon find itself in conflict. It makes more sense to try to develop habits of conflict resolution that are effective for non-violently resolving conflict between human beings along any front of conflict. In this way, every level of conflict can be used as an opportunity to practice developing non-violent skills and habits of conflict resolution, mutual justice and respect, and coexistence. Every front of conflict is an opportunity to learn to literally place one's consciousness in one's heart, to step into others' shoes, and to engage sincerely in cooperative dialogue. If we encourage Israelis, by we I mean the U.S. government, I don't consider the U.S. government we, so if the U.S. government encourages Israelis to be harsh and to feel superior towards Palestinians or towards Hamas, we're not helping Israel to develop positive human dynamics that it can transfer to the many divisions amongst Jews. We're only encouraging attitudes of hatred, divisiveness, and hierarchy. What's important is to develop the habits of cooperative dialogue, caring, and nonviolent cooperative conflict resolution at every front of conflict with which one finds oneself, whether internationally, nationally, or in the community, workplace, and home. An ideal U.S. government would encourage Jewish Israelis and Palestinians to handle every one of their fronts of conflict within and between themselves in a cooperative, caring, thoughtful way. Number 4, the fourth consequence, which relates to number 3. Failure to address Jewish-Israeli fronts of conflict and develop positive habits of human dynamics. This is a more detailed development of consequence number 3 with regard to the multiple fronts of conflict on the Jewish-Israeli side. And we'll talk about the fronts of conflict within the Palestinian side in a different video. Instead of assuming that all Jewish people have been of one mind, it's important to understand that intense conflict exists amongst Jewish people. There are extremely hateful divisions according to ethnicity, religious sect, the role of religion in politics, goals for Israel, views on social issues, and relations with other nations. For example, in the New Israelis, Yossi Melman writes in 1992 of 3 levels of status in Israel, which can be very harsh and isolating. On top are the Ashkenazis with ancestors from Eastern Europe. Then the Sephardim with ancestors from Northern Africa and coming from Spain and Portugal. And then the Arab Israelis. Hatred and hierarchical feelings of superiority also exist across divisions of religious sects, such as the divisions between secular Jews, Reform Jews, Orthodox Jews, and ultra-Orthodox Jews. The divisions even within these groups can be more hateful than the divisions between them. And you can probably relate to some of this in your own lives, where you think of divisions you're aware of, and maybe how your own frustrations or hatreds are greatest with people even within your own group. From Beirut to Jerusalem, Tom Friedman describes an American-style reform service of Israeli Jews at the Baka Synagogue in Jerusalem in 1986. An ultra-Orthodox rabbi and about 30 of his acquaintances unexpectedly entered the reform service. The ultra-Orthodox were horrified that men and women were dancing together in a circle dance. They screamed at the dancers, called them names, said they were evil, and claimed that it was precisely because of people like them that there had been a Holocaust. At least one even kicked a participant and threatened to kill him. Yossi Melman, reports that in Jerusalem, quote, Orthodox platoons smash billboards showing half-naked fashion models and throw stones at cars driving on the Sabbath. ... The secular warriors conduct raids on Orthodox areas and cover walls with anti-religious graffiti. Their unorthodox warfare also includes the opening of cinemas, theaters, and restaurants on Friday nights and operating public bus services on Saturdays. Secular activities came to a brutal climax when, in the spring of 1991, a pig's head was placed in the doorway of a synagogue. So you've got Orthodox smashing billboards, and then secular Jews putting anti-religious graffiti on walls and putting this pig's head on the synagogue. In fact, the Orthodox frequently argue, this is the quote continuing, the Orthodox frequently argue that the behavior of secular Israelis reminds them of anti-Semitism. Nowhere, it seems, are Orthodox Jews more feared and hated than in the Jewish state itself. And here's an inner quote, when I see those Orthodox folk, I can understand the anti-Semite, end quote, is a fairly common expression among secular Israelites. ... The Orthodox are viewed as parasites. End of the quote. If Orthodox Jews are feared and hated nowhere more than in Israel itself, what was the point of creating Israel? If hatred and fear are human characteristics that will appear within any group, why the need to believe that separation of different ethnic groups will promote peace? Melman writes, and I'm not saying that ethnic groups shouldn't do this or that Israel shouldn't be there. But these questions should be thought about. Mailman writes, quote, "In a male chauvinist society like Israel's, where army service is equated with social status, the religious folk were perceived as marginal and ridiculous. They're probably not conscripted. Secular kids called their religious peers names and treated them as inferiors," end quote. He adds, quote, "The emerging mood of religious-secular relations is one of increased friction and growing mutual isolation. On the one hand, it seems that both sectors are becoming more militant every day and willing to take risks in confronting each other. On the other hand, each sector is sinking ever deeper into itself and concentrating on its own secluded communities. Their children attend separate schools and usually marry within their own communities. There are no serious attempts to exchange useful ideas between the two sectors, to explore better possibilities for peaceful coexistence and mutual reconciliation." End quote. In fact, resolving prejudice requires much more than an appreciation of diversity. It requires addressing the we-they attitude, the desire to feel superior to another, and the thirst for a sense of value, belonging, and worth. Differences will be pounced upon and taken advantage of as a reason to feel superior to another, as a reason to hate and taunt others. But differences are not necessarily the underlying cause of hatred and conflict between groups seeking to feel superior to the other. For even when differences don't exist, this drive to feel superior can still lead to hatred and conflict because of the absence of a sense of self-esteem that is independent from feelings of superiority, and because of a desperate need to belong to a group that feels superior as a means of feeling emotionally and socially secure. So to address that, you need to find healthy sources of self-esteem. Israel is clearly a nation in need of healing. I mean, think how it was formed. Many were refugees. Many had gone through hell and terrible terror or lost all members of their family. So certain traits from the trauma could have been passed on. Its government must be condemned for its brutality and injustice. Measures must be taken to ensure that such brutality and injustice cease. Yet, keeping in mind all people's needs to feel a sense of self-worth and belonging, it's also important to provide moral and social support to all Israelis, including those who have behaved badly, to take an upward path towards inner harmony, caring, and respect and safety for all. And as I said, the topic of fronts of conflict amongst Palestinians is located in point 13 in a later video. Consequence number 5. Trampling democracy, trampling Israeli voices. Related to the point of multiple fronts of conflict is the trampling of democracy. When the multiple fronts are ignored, not only are positive habits of nonviolent conflict resolution ignored, but the many voices are also ignored within a population, an undemocratic consequence. Just as the post-coup Ukrainian government disproportionately represents the ultra-right segment of the Ukrainian population, the Israeli government is also unrepresentative of the general Israeli population. The current Israeli coalition government of ultranationalists and ultra-Orthodox, even more so than past Israeli administrations, is representative of only one sliver of the population, a sliver that, based on what I've read, is narrow-minded, uncooperative, ethnocentric, and militant. It would be a disservice to Israel if the U.S. government were to equate being pro-Israel and anti-Holocaust with being supportive of the Israeli government, even as it tramples the voices of many, if not the majority, of Israelis. You can be against the Holocaust You can be for the state of Israel or for the Jewish people. Some people are for or against the state of Israel, but you can be for the Jewish people, against the Holocaust, but still be against the Israeli government, especially the current one. Here are a few examples of the current Israeli government's lack of support from the Israeli people, including the police, courts, and military. In 2007, Itamar Ben-Gvir, the leader of the ultra-nationalist party Jewish Power, now Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's national security minister, was, quote, convicted by an Israeli court for incitement to racism and support of a terror organization, end quote. So the Israeli court condemned him. Incidentally, the Kach party, quote, the ideological progenitor of Ben-Gvir's political party, end quote, was once on the U.S. list of foreign terrorist organizations. Another example, following the violence of May 2021, quote, Israel's chief of police, Kobi Shabtai, explicitly accused Ben-Gvir of serving as a catalyst for the deadly unrest that fanned the flames of insecurity, end quote. And that quote's from the United States, I believe it's the United States Institute of Peace. Following the Israeli police raid upon Al-Aqsa in April 2023, in response to hundreds of Palestinian youth barricading themselves inside with rocks and firecrackers, quote, the unbridled violence of the police crackdown, ... prompted even Israel's chief of police to register concern, end quote. Now, just so you know, the chief of police, Kobi Shabtai, he's been in the news saying some things that to me seem pretty drastic. He says some things were taken out of context. And maybe they were. You have to respect that because you see all over the news things being taken out of the context. But no matter what he's saying now, it's just interesting to know that he was accusing Itamar Ben-Gvir of serving as a catalyst for this unrest, so this conflict even within the Israelis in the government. The U.S. Institute of Peace writes, quote, normalization with the Arab world, like creating friendly relations with them, is deeply popular amongst Israelis. But Netanyahu's most extreme coalition partners, on whom he relies politically, are driven more by their annexationist and Temple Mount / Haram al-Sharif sovereignty goals than by the lure of regional normalization or fear of the international community's condemnation. So they're not concerned with improving relations or having the international community's approval. Quote, this is the most, and this is also from the United States Institute of Peace, quote, this is the most right-wing and extreme government in Israel's history. It has already brought Israelis to the streets in protest and prompted strong statements of concern from former Israeli diplomatic and security officials. Even the current chief of staff of Israel's defense forces has weighed in with security concerns, end quote. And it's interesting because the quote about the chief of police, Kobi Shabtai, was saying that they're not going to tolerate right now any protests against what the Israeli government's doing to the Palestinians. So you can be arrested for protesting that. But apparently many Israelis already were protesting this extreme right-wing government. To ignore all these Jewish voices, including the many Jewish voices who would like peace with Palestinians and friendship, and to put one's ear only to the voice of one narrow segment of that population is harmful, dangerous, undemocratic, immoral, and illogical. And the number 6 consequence, the last one in this video, giving the reins of power to those Israelis who seek to dominate Palestinians and to dominate their fellow Israelis. When the many voices in Israel today are ignored by the government and the media, when the many voices amongst Jews and amongst Zionists themselves are ignored, the result is not only an undemocratic representation of those voices, but also a tragic loss of opportunities for cooperation. For many of those unrepresented, unheard voices, as in the United States, are the voices of those who seek nonviolent conflict resolution with Palestinians and democratic, humane treatment of them. And it's the same in the United States. The unheard voices want peace, peaceful attitudes towards the Middle East, with Russia, with North Korea, and not in an ideal, not in a fantastic, idealistic, unrealistic way. We see the roots of violence. We understand the pathway towards non-violent conflict resolution, and that is the only sensible route to take. But these voices are oppressed. Americans are oppressed by fellow Americans in government. Israelis are oppressed by Israelis in government. Repeatedly, throughout Israel's very creation and history, the harshest and most extreme elements, the elements who seek to dominate Palestinians, have a way of dominating fellow Israelis and getting their way. This has also happened within the U.S. government. Those Americans who most sought to dominate foreign nations also sought to dominate their fellow Americans within the U.S. government and in society. I mean, you hear people in the U.S. government who were fired or who retired or, quit because they were just being silenced. In fact, this is similar to Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s statements. And I mention him because he's running for U.S. president. His statements that his uncle, John F. Kennedy, was surrounded by military brass who were really pushing him to go to war at various times, like to invade Cuba and have nuclear war with Russia, or to send troops or weapons. They sought to dominate foreigners, and they sought to dominate JFK. So I think it's my theory, but I also see evidence of it, that the people who want to really dominate the foreigners or dominate those people of that other religion also want to dominate their fellow patriots. They want to dominate those within their own religion. It's a psychological habit of wanting to be on top. It happens even within the CIA. Those agents who say, you always just want to throw cash and arms at groups to solve problems. You never look at the roots of the conflict. Those people in the CIA get sidelined by those who want to take sides in foreign conflicts and who see these conflicts in terms of good versus evil and who see solutions as weapons and cash. It may be that those who love to dominate foreigners also love to dominate those of another ethnicity, another religion, another gender, and another age group. Again, it's perhaps driven by a misguided search for self-worth or for emotional security. It is essential that we all recognize this dynamic. And by the way, it happens in the area of information dominance, the censorship within our country and other countries. That's domination, another form of seeking to dominate people in other countries, seeking to dominate fellow Americans. It is essential that we all recognize this dynamic, seek to prevent its development, call attention to it, and stand courageously against it wherever we see it. That's the end of part 1. Next video will be about hearing the varied voices of Zionism. Thank you very, very much for listening. I appreciate it. Take care. Good night.